All right, welcome everybody to the PFAS and Biosolids stakeholder meeting. If anybody has any technical assistance needs, they can call 518-402-8005. At the conclusion of the presentation, we will have a Q&A. It'll be through the chat box, so if you have anything to ask or any comments, you have the chat icon in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Molly Tremblay and we will get started. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. Thanks, everybody, for a great turnout. We're here today because we all have an interest in PFAS and recycled biosolids. I want to start out by framing what this meeting is. This meeting is an initial presentation and chance to ask questions and provide feedback on potential regulatory revisions to our Part 361-2 and 3 rules governing the recycling of biosolids. Your input from this meeting and any subsequent follow-up will help us as we draft updated regulations to incorporate these emerging contaminants into the existing rules. This is not going to be your only opportunity to comment on these revisions to the regs. There will still be a formal comment period that comes with the full rulemaking process. We welcome feedback and suggestions or ideas today, definitely, but if you will still have an opportunity to provide more formal comments and feedback when the draft regs are actually made public. This meeting is a way to bring you in early to the rulemaking process. So you have additional time to consider what may be proposed with the rule and to offer some feedback. We're holding onto the registration attendee info. So I think when you came in, you had to check whether you wanted to be contacted or not. So we'll hold on to all that and we'll send updates to your email about the rulemaking process so you won't miss any announcements or important dates as we progress. I also want to mention before we dive into specifics, there's a larger DEC-wide PFAS work group. Biosolids is but one of many topics that we're tackling, from air to remediation, water, fish and wildlife, solid waste management. There's a lot going on at DEC and our sister agencies to address PFAS in all media and aspects. So some of these actions were actually outlined recently in the governor's press release. As we know, there hasn't been enough federal action to control PFAS contamination, but that's not stopping New York from taking the necessary steps to protect public health and the environment. DEC is moving forward regardless, trying to tackle PFAS across all environmental media. I'll also mention that this rulemaking is only part of a larger overall program at DEC to manage PFAS and biosolids. So we'll discuss much more of this, but I wanted to be clear that we're not just developing regulations. There are multiple program policies on this topic. We are supporting research on the environmental impacts of PFAS and biosolids, both with SUNY ESF as well as SUNY Albany. We funded 2 initial sampling programs because we know having data is important to see the impact of what's to come. So regulations are a major piece of this overall effort. All right, let's make sure my slides are moving. Awesome, great. All right, so let's move into some of the details. Okay, let's start by talking about where biosolids come from. Biosolids are a byproduct of the wastewater treatment process. So residential, commercial, and some industrial sources, so mostly our homes and businesses, send their wastewater to be managed by WRFs, or water resource recovery facilities. That's where it's treated by several different technologies before it's allowed to be discharged from the plant. We have just over 600 WRFs in New York State, as you can see, from everywhere, rural, small to giant city plants, all different sizes and treatment methods. And they all have to deal with biosolids in one way or another. They're a byproduct of the overall treatment process. Biosolids settle out or are removed after treatment, and they're sent for one of several different end uses. One of those options is disposal. So that means taking the biosolids and carting them to a landfill or a waste combustion facility. And you can see from the pie charts approximately how much is being managed this way in New York. So the bigger chart there shows the breakdown of how biosolids are managed. So landfilled, incinerated, or beneficially used or recycled. As you can see there, about 70% of it is landfilled. So in total, only about 16% total of biosolids statewide are being sent on to some form of recycling or some form of beneficial use, whether that be composting, land application, or another process. Nationally, that number is around 50%. So while it's a small program comparatively here in New York, we do think it's an important one. I'll also add that DEC does not dictate how a municipality chooses to manage its biosolids. So these decisions are made by the locality based on a lot of different things. Size, sustainability practices, costs, hauling, logistics. There's a number of factors that weigh into that decision overall. And DEC does encourage the beneficial use of biosolids, calling it out in the State Solid Waste Management Plan, the Climate Act goals. But like any recycling practice, it needs to be controlled. If it's done properly in accordance with the regulations, it can have real positive impacts. Some communities have invested a lot of money into developing effective and technologically sophisticated recycling facilities. They want to get this right as well. And so that brings me into our next slide, looking at the regulations as they exist today. In New York State, the Solid Waste Management Facility Regulations, Part 360 series, in order to process biosolids, you need a permit. You always need a permit with DEC to recycle biosolids. There are no registrations or exemptions or other regulatory tiers for that waste type. Any amount of biosolids recycled requires a full permit process. And New York State's rules were developed in parallel to EPA's Part 503 federal regulations. But while they are very similar, New York's rules are a little more stringent. We have additional operating controls, tighter pollutant limits, which help minimize risk even further. A lot goes into the permit applications here at DEC ahead of approval. All the permit applications need to be certified by a professional engineer and include all relevant plans and maps that are required in Part 360. So there's two main areas of biosolids recycling that you'll hear about. You probably know them as Class A and Class B. This is really referring to the types of processes that the material undergoes to reduce pathogens. Class A biosolids are treated to a level that there are virtually no detectable pathogens in the final product, and the end materials typically have a much wider use. This could be like a compost, a heat-dried, pelletized product, something that's undergone another process dictated in the regs to remove pathogens effectively to be determined a Class A product. Class B biosolids have significantly reduced but still potentially detectable pathogens, and those require additional management practices for land application. These permits, these Class B land application permits, are for applications on usually agricultural land and must follow specific site management strategies to reduce public health and environmental risks. So this includes things like limiting public contact, buffer zone requirements, slope restrictions, incorporation rules, limits on grazing animals and the types of crop, etc. Class B permits require the site operator to analyze the biosolid sources as well as the soil and to detail every field receiving biosolids within the permit. So each field that's going to receive biosolids under the permit needs to be looked at to determine nutrient needs of the crop. It also looks to determine application rates, which will be different from crop to crop depending on the crop's agronomic needs. And they also need to, an applicant also needs to include not only in their permit application, but their annual reports, their anticipated plan for next year's applications and all of that data. So PFAS is not currently required to be tested in the regulations, federal or state, for biosolids. This is why we're moving forward with the rulemaking at this time. And we know that revisions to the regs are never a fast process, for better or for worse. That's why we established 2 interim policies to obtain data and reduce potential risks while we work to finalize new rules. All right. Okay. Sorry, if you see me looking to the side, that's where my slides are. All right, our first policy, DMM7. Talk a little bit about that. This establishes interim PFAS and PFOA sampling criteria for recycled biosolids sources, right? So from the wastewater treatment plants, from the WRFs, and the actions that DEC will take based on those results. These are the biosolids coming directly from the WRFs or treatment plants, and they're either land applied on agricultural fields or sent for further processing, like in a compost process, et cetera. So when DMM7 was issued, it appeared that EPA was moving forward with revisions to federal Part 503 to address PFAS and recycled biosolids. It's no longer totally evident that EPA is moving in that direction, so DEC is not going to wait. But part of a rulemaking obligates us to assess the impacts or the changes that the new rules could have to existing and proposed facilities. So we can't do any assessing if we don't have any data. And we recognize this needed to be addressed and that a program policy was the most effective way to move that forward. It helps us to adapt to new test methods, to troubleshoot issues at labs or common analytical issues that we're finding with the methods, and also to learn more in order to support the rulemaking as a whole. All right, let me pop over here. bring you some of the details. All right. Perfect. All right, this policy is taking major steps towards setting the first PFAS standard for biosolids recycled in New York. This is the first go. For those unfamiliar with other states like Michigan's extensive work on this, they were able to analyze their biosolids and determine which plants were most impacted by industrial sources coming into the plant. We use their results and findings as a basis for the concept of DMM7. In essence, we're limiting biosolids limits to levels that reflect impacts from the home, not industrial sources. So these are PFAS that come from toilet paper and other consumer products. PFAS that homeowners are directly exposed to through the products they use every day, as opposed to industrial discharges. All right, so looking at this whole issue through a wide lens, we know that removing the contaminant from entering the waste stream to begin with, right, way upstream, really gets us the best, for lack of a better term, bang for our buck in terms of controlling pollutants. Historically, plants have had a strong emphasis put on pre-treatment programs, and we've seen significant reductions in pollutants from those efforts. Same concept here, right? We remove the industrial impacted materials that move through the wastewater treatment process and end up in biosolids. DEC is also looking to control those sources through other requirements, and a lot more is happening upstream at pollution control. So landfill leachate treatment rules, prohibitions on the use of PFAS in certain consumer products like food packaging, apparel, there's firefighting foam rules, right? We have a lot going on in terms of removing the pollutants from upstream. Our other big intent here was to start gathering data with this policy. Unfortunately, at the time, there were long lab timeframes, and we kept hearing about the difficulties affording or finding labs for a lot of facilities. And in order to address these concerns, DEC decided to commit significant staff resources and funds to conduct that first round of sampling. So DEC trained dozens of our own staff on sampling methods. We visited every WRF that recycled with biosolids and sampled the influent, effluent, and biosolids there. We also, which was about 90 plants total, if you remember from the previous slide. DEC also contracted with SUNY ESF to analyze those samples in their lab and take a closer look at potential sources and PFAS changes in the unit operations. So ESF was already engaged with this work at the time and had experience researching and analyzing for PFAS. They're able to take a look at each plant with a research perspective and really see what's going on. Unfortunately, some delays and equipment issues did slow the project down. We're behind where we wanted to be overall. But we're working closely with ESF, and as of this week, we have some of the data, and we're able to start getting it into the appropriate format to share widely. So hang tight. I know there's been a lot of requests, a lot of people waiting for it, but we're working on it right now. ESF's final research report, when that comes to, when they're all set and have everything publicized, we'll also be publishing that on our website when complete. We have a second state-funded program that I'd also like to talk about. We often work closely with our Division of Water staff on these issues, and they were able to coordinate with a DEC-funded private ELAP certified lab that will be handling additional samples from these same 90-ish WRFs that recycle their biosolids. This was done through a request for information, or RFI process, and we've sent out about 50% of the sampling kits so far. This one works a little different in that we're providing guidance, the sampling kits, and prepaid shipping labels to the staff at the WRFs, so they can take those samples themselves and have them analyzed at no cost to them. Results are starting to come in from this study as well. You'll be able to see them posted on DEC's public website. There's actually an information portal that the Division of Water runs with emerging contaminant information at Speedies Permittees. And so all the data from that lab study will be posted on that platform. All right. Hop in here. All right, DMM 7A. This is a new policy that just went through a short public comment period. We've been reviewing all those comments now and are prepping the final policy to be issued sometime this month. DMM 7A builds upon the requirements of DMM 7 in that it requires more sampling. This time we're looking at the products generated from biosolids. So, right, the compost, the digestates, the Class A materials. So where DMM 7 focuses on the biosolid sources, here we're looking at end products like compost. So while 7A requires sampling, I'll say it does not set any standards on or limits on use of the product. So since we are close and involved in the rulemaking process now, that effort is really the best avenue for product standards, and we'll be looking to add that in the draft 361-3 revisions. The data that we get from 7A, from this policy, will help us further understand what impacts would be to existing facilities under potential new regulations. All right, to the fun stuff. All right, so controlling environmental risk is more than just pollutant standards, right? It's also about controlling overall exposure. A change being considered in the rules is to further restrict the types of crops that can be grown on agricultural fields where biosolids are applied. The time limits would be removed. No food crops can be grown on those sites. Another addition is we will be removing livestock grazing as an option. So no livestock grazing at all will be allowed on Class B land applied agricultural fields. These are conservative restrictions given the soil standards that we're going to propose, but it provides additional significant safeguards. We're also looking at requiring sampling and analysis for PFAS in biosolids sources as well as products. So again, continuing to require the analyses that we started looking for under DMM 7 and 7A. We're also considering requiring soil sampling at land application sites for PFAS annually. Each field would need to be sampled and approved before land application can actually occur there. And finally, we're considering using the philosophy that our Division of Environmental Remediation uses for unrestricted use of the soil. So I'll explain that a bit more on the next slide. Something else to note, we've been working really well with other agencies when considering the EPA risk assessment and moving forward with our own regulations, not only just internally DEC with environmental remediation and water staff, but also our New York State Department of Health and New York State Department of Ag and Markets have been instrumental in helping and guiding us along. All right. All right, here's a summary. This slide is a summary of potential standards that biosolids recycling permittees would need to meet. So you'll see in the top half, those are what biosolids sources destined for land application or Class B will need to meet to be applied in the proposed regs. These are also what we are proposing Class A biosolids products need to meet. Again, with the data we received from DMM 7 and 7A, we'll be able to assess the impact as the rulemaking proceeds. So below those numbers, our next chunk down, you'll see maximum soil concentration on ag sites. So this goes back to what we were talking about with the soil sampling data. But with that field data, we're looking to assess whether the field is appropriate for biosolids application in the first place. So we envision being able to calculate the site life of each field, similar to the process done for metals in the past, but this time for PFAS loading. For those unfamiliar, our Division of Environmental Remediation took a really comprehensive look at background PFAS soil levels in New York State. You can check out the full report on DEC's website, but basically they looked at sites that were unimpacted and uncontaminated by industry and found in various rural areas across New York State. So what we're proposing here and what concept we'd like to follow is that biosolids land applied should not elevate PFAS levels in the soil beyond typical rural background soil levels. We recognize this is very conservative because of the other restrictions we already discussed, like no food crops, no grazing. A higher level may not actually pose a threat in this scenario, but given the uncertainty that still exists concerning leaching, crop uptake, et cetera, at this time, this was the appropriate approach. We plan to provide guidance on calculating the site life and impacts of biosolids as it is applied to land for permittees. We know this is a big change. There will be a bit of a learning curve as we get going, but we're comfortable providing guidance and moving forward with helping applicants figure out how this is going to work. We want to get a draft rule out to everybody this spring so we can begin the formal comment period and all of the documentation associated with a formal rulemaking. In the interim, we'll continue to keep sampling under DMM 7 and 7A and supporting research efforts to help us fully understand the impacts of PFAS and biosolids. All right. Again, I really appreciate everyone coming out today to listen, ask questions, comment. I'm sure we have some questions that are already coming into the chat. I've got some colleagues in the room that are helping me navigate those. But feel free to add anything you want us to answer in the chat box now if you want to add question, comment, feedback, anything. If we're unable to get to any specific questions today, we'll be sure to follow up. We already have your contact information from the registrations, but I hope to get to at least most of them today. Constructive feedback is also always welcome. If you're more comfortable sending feedback outside of this webinar, not everybody likes to speak up or type in the chat, or if you think of something later, feel free to email our group here. We have a general email address. Actually, I should pop up my last slide here, biosolids@dec.ny.gov. Our whole group manages that inbox, and somebody will be able to look at your comments and questions there. Thank you again. Really appreciate your time. And I think we'll get going, starting to look at, I'll leave my end slide up here so you can see the Biosolids email for a little while, and I think we'll just start diving into questions. So feel free again to add things in the chat while we prepare and look at those. All right.
Great. We have a question about how soil concentrations will be calculated. Is it average over a specific depth? Is it based on soil type, et cetera?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And any feedback you have on that topic is appreciated. You're welcome to send it in or let us know. But currently, as we were thinking of proposing it, it would be soil samples would be required to be composite samples, and we would be looking at the median of those soil samples across each field. There will be more specifics in the draft, but if you have any, proposals for that or something you're thinking of, feel free to send it in. But yeah, we're looking at median average across each field.
And then related to that, someone asked, how does the max soil concentration apply to Class A products?
Yeah, that's different. So Class A products, as you know, they have different restrictions on them, right? So they're not actually permitted per field that they're applied on. So a final Class A product would not have the same restrictions that a Class B land applied product would. However, if there is a Class A product that's going to be land applied for more than 5 years, I believe we proposed, then you would need to come into the department and look at the site life just like a land application site would. So nothing generally required for that, but when consecutive applications are done with the same product, we would look at that site for site life.
Someone asked, will livestock feed crops still be allowed to be grown at Class B sites under the new proposed changes?
Yep, good question. Yeah, feed crops are still okay. The way we're thinking of proposing it now is to restrict food crops. Yeah. But yeah, livestock feed, fine.
And then, somewhat related, is the livestock grazing ban a deed restriction or a time restriction? And what proposed time frame would we be looking at if it was a time restriction?
This would be a restriction in the permit altogether. I don't know if I can answer exactly the whole. I don't think there's anything tied specific, but it would be a restriction in your permit document.
Right, it would not be included in a deed restriction, which you sometimes see in remediation sites, cleanup sites. This is not that kind of restriction. This is during the life of your permit. And part of this is because we expect to have more information 5 years from now or 10 years from now and see if these things may change. So at this point, it's during the life of your permit, you are held to that restriction, but they're not required to put it in the deed.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
We have a question about changes, if any of these changes would be affecting municipalities broadly.
I guess in a way, yeah. So any municipality that manages biosolids, which is all of them, but those that recycle their biosolids, yes, it's possible. The onus on the permit is on the permit holder, right, when we do these regulations. So the Part 361 permitted facility, and the permit holder is responsible for getting us all that data, all those analyticals long term. So it's on that, but it will come down to looking at every waste type, and biosolids come from a municipal wastewater treatment plant, right? So it will affect municipalities in that, yeah, there may be different management options that are required for your waste stream.
Related to that, another person asked if the department has considered any additional or specific funding mechanisms to assist municipalities with the additional incurred costs of these proposed regulations.
Yeah, that's a good question. We do have two 2 funded sampling programs in the works already to help alleviate this. We've considered other things as well. I don't have any specific additional program to discuss at this time, unfortunately, but we are looking into that. But for now, funding the sampling and working in that direction has been how we can help the best.
We have a question about the background soil concentration, asking how they will be evaluated or monitored and how that's different from the current arrangement.
One more time, sorry.
I think you might have touched on this a little bit. I think this person maybe just needs a little bit of clarification. They're asking how background soil concentrations will be evaluated or monitored and how this will be different from the current arrangement.
Yep. So right now, there are soil samples taken for pH and things like that to make sure that the application is right and the crop's going to not be hurt, et cetera. But this will add C1633, right? So the PFAS, the full suite of PFASs to the soil, to the soil sampling that's required in the permit application. So that field will need to be sampled, composite samples across, I believe, there's a certain frequency that'll be outlined in the regs of how many per acre. And then you'll calculate the median of each field in order to determine if it's suitable for a land application or not.
Okay, so this one is kind of a long one, so
Okay.
Just bear with me here. This person said DEC standards in DMM7 are 10 times less protective than main standards, which were created 5 or 10 years ago before the state banned land application, that state being Maine, in 2022. Main standards for PFOA and PFOS were determined based on modeling to avoid groundwater contamination using EPA's PFAS less than MCL of 7 parts per trillion. Main standards were 2.5 parts per billion for PFOS and 5.3 parts per billion for PFOA. New York State's MCL are 10 parts per trillion, and EPA set considerably lower MCLs for 6 different PFAS, and Maine has adopted these MCLs, and Wisconsin is adopting them. This person also said that pretending that only PFOA and PFOS matter is very cynical. It has been demonstrated that PFAS compounds are transformed into new PFAS at wastewater treatment plants and in the soil and at composting facilities.
Thanks. Yep, we'll tackle that.
To start, yeah, a little bit of what's happening in, and not to speak for Maine, but our understanding of what's going on in Maine in terms of standard setting. Originally, they had standards set for soil based on potential remediation sites and groundwater standards based on modeling of what potential could happen to groundwater. They have, since then in Maine, they've actually went out and sampled the sites, all the land, done groundwater sampling, soil sampling at land application sites, and they have found that the modeling for groundwater seems to be overly conservative. They don't see the groundwater impacts that were associated with the concentrations in the soil. So they're rethinking that issues as well. Also, looking at, again, the numbers we're looking for in soil here come from background soil studies, which our remediation group has shown from their sampling to date have not caused groundwater issues. So we expect the same here. Again, the numbers we're looking at in the soil here really are the key to great protections for groundwater sources and other there. The question of, what parameters, of course, PFAS goes well beyond PFOA and PFOS. We understand that. We are requiring sampling of the whole suite that's required under the only approved test method at this time for PFAS. So we'll have 40 parameters. We can only set those standards on what data is present for the most based on toxicity and availability research. And right now, we're comfortable that PFOA and PFOS meet both the risk standard and the availability of data. That doesn't mean we won't continue to look at those other parameters that may show up in that suite of 40, or if test method increases. We'll also look at top assays, other total fluorine, other test methods we're aware of that are out there to look at these materials. And that's part of why we're sponsoring research at UAlbany and other places to look at, is there a better way to look at the whole group or look at the impacts from the beyond just those 2 parameters. But today, understanding it's a dynamic area of research, And looking at impacts, we think this is appropriate for where we are right now.
Thank you.
Thank you both.
Next up, someone asked, I think this is maybe something where we just need a little bit of clarification. Why is DMM7 not focused on industrial sources? Molly said only focused on home uses. Industrial sources would contribute more PFAS, so why is the focus not on that source?
Yep, no, didn't mean to confuse. So DMM7 and the levels that are dictated within it are actually focusing on removing biosolids that have high industrial impacts to them. So we want to be able to look upstream and see some of these sources. If they're coming in too high, right, then they're clearly industrially impacted, and be able to look upstream and either potentially remove those industrial sources to the plant or remove that as a source that can be recycled to a facility, et cetera. So it's really looking at having, we want the solids under DMM7 to reflect more of just a homeowner influence as opposed to industrial impact. So sorry to confuse there.
Awesome. I'm trying to kind of group our questions together into similar topics as we're kind of coming in, as they're coming in.
Mm-hmm.
So we talked about some of this earlier, but some of these questions weren't in yet. Let's circle back to some of the agricultural concerns. Someone asked if there's concern that feed for livestock grown in these fields would lead to contamination of their products, such as their beef or their milk.
Yep, that's a good question. From the research that I've looked at to date, it's not as large of a concern, that pathway, right? So when we're looking at risks, we look at it through different pathways. Food crops for direct human consumption is the one that we're going to be limiting here. That's the one that has the highest impact on you, and direct livestock grazing. Research that's been done to date has not shown that feed crops fed to livestock are as impactful. So to date, that's what the research is showing us. We're also looking into, there is some research that I believe we mentioned with SUNY Albany, looking at general crop uptake, and so we'll have a lot more information there about what types of crops may, uptake it more, et cetera. And that research, again, it's really dynamic, and it's really changing every day and still being conducted. So, but the short answer to your question, there will be no restrictions on feed crops, and no, department's not currently concerned about those materials going to livestock.
And remembering again that the soil limits we're setting here are based on rural unimpacted soils, unindustrial impacted soils. So these are soils that are out there today without any biosolids, without any other materials, probably not even in agriculture for most part. So the material crops are already being grown on these today. So we're looking at levels that are essentially background levels as has been determined by sampling. So we think the risk is very low because of that choosing to take that stance in these regulations. Right.
That conservative stance gives us
more assurance that there's not going to be a problem.
Molly, I think maybe some people are having trouble hearing me, so someone asked if you could repeat the question before you answer it.
Oh, okay.
So if we could just do that moving forward.
Yep, I'm loud, sorry.
I think I'm just too quiet. I don't think it's you. So we now have a couple questions on out-of-state biosolids. First, they asked, how will you track out-of-state biosolids?
Yeah, so currently so the question is about how do we track out-of-state biosolids. Those are currently need an approval to be distributed in state. So if you have a Class A biosolids material that you're generating out of state and you want to distribute it in New York State, you need to come into DEC for an approval process. It's under our regs in 361-3.8. Yep. What that incorporates is basically you need to come in and show us that you're meeting the same standards for your Class A products that we would expect here in New York State. So we look at your existing permit in another state, we look at the analytics from the product, et cetera, and there's also an annual reporting process in this. You would get an approval if everything checked out for 5 years, and you need to come in every 5 years and show us again all the analytics, et cetera, and your existing permit. Again, there's an annual reporting process, so every year they send in a report on like how much was distributed in New York, the analytics, the lab sheets that go along with those products, and DMM 7A will, when it is released, it will incorporate those into it as well. So all of the products coming in from out of state will need to be sampled under DMM 7A, just like the products that are created in New York State. So any biosolids product being used in New York State will be covered under DMM 7A, so they'll need to start sampling for the full suite of PFAS.
And then someone asked, what kind of new restrictions / oversight are being considered for biosolids being shipped in from out of state?
Yep, so I think I answered that a little bit already, but same idea. We are going to hold biosolids coming into the state to the same standards that we have ones that are developed in state. So that would become a part of all that same sampling and analytics will become part of their approval process, just like the ones in state do.
Awesome. Someone asked if biochar derived from digestate or other more conventional sources, such as woody waste, fall under DMM 7A.
So I think the question is getting at like wood-developed biochar. So the feedstocks for those typically are like wood and other carbon-heavy products. I don't believe that, so if there's no biosolids, right, the residuals from the wastewater treatment plant involved in that, no, then these don't apply to that. So biochar created from wood waste, et cetera, does not fall under the purview of DMM 7A.
But if there is some work and some talk about making biochar from biosolids, in that case, if the facility is producing biochar from biosolids, then the policies and the regulations would apply.
Right.
But as Molly said, it's restricted to those that accept biosolids.
And if someone was making a biochar from a biosolids, right, of residuals from the wastewater treatment plant process, they would need to come into us for a Part 361 permit.
Awesome. We have a question about PFAS destruction treatment and if DEC will be supporting PFAS destruction treatment tests in the near future.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I unfortunately don't work in PFAS destruction techniques, but I've been doing a lot of research and following along what other divisions have done. I mean, I would keep active and looking for that. There's a lot of work being done, not only on the remediation standpoint, but at treatment plants in themselves. So keep posted. I unfortunately don't have a lot of information on that.
Good. Thank you. What are the lab test detection levels for PFOA and PFOS in soils? So what are those detection limits at the moment?
It's going to depend on the lab. Everything's going to be done under everything that we are proposing under DMM 7, 7A, and any upcoming rulemakings are all going to require that they use the most up-to-date approved method by the EPA, which currently is EPA method 1633A. So you can dive into all the specifics of that if you'd like. So, but it's really going to depend on the lab.
Right. And Molly did mention on our DEC website there is a rural soil study, and you can look at that. You'll see the labs were able to get to well below less than 1 part per billion in the soil. So if the question I think is getting at, are the labs are going to be able to get down to detection limits that were near the requirements we're looking at in the regulations, we don't think that will be an issue.
Yeah, and as issues have come up throughout industry, right, there's been some struggles, for example, with high water content sludge, right? So it's harder to sample, liquid sludges and solid sludges. These problems are being worked out by labs as we progress. So there's been multiple ways to deal with that now, and we're starting to see much better detection limits in labs as they progress and figure out exactly what they're doing and getting a handle on all of these methods.
So sorry. Here we go. I'm back. Are we anticipating PFAS testing of biosolids that are sent to landfills? They say this could be a big source of PFAS for landfill leachate and want to hear our thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a good question. So we are not proposing that in a 361 rulemaking. 361 rules really focus on biosolids recycling facilities. What you will want to look into, though, is there is a draft rulemaking for landfill leachate. If you want to get involved in that discussion, there's also another meeting on, I believe, February 11th. You can check that out on our website. But no, we do not have any intention of requiring biosolids on the materials management standpoint to be sampled for going to landfill. I'll let, if anyone from Division of Water wants to jump in, if they know of anything that's required, but as far as our rulemaking goes, nothing's going to be required of biosolid facilities that are just disposing of their biosolids.
Right. It may be required by the landfill, remembering that the landfill owner-operator always has the ability to require testing and setting limits themselves of stuff that they accept into that landfill. So there's really two levels, what DEC requires of that landfill before accepting material, and what that landfill itself may go beyond that to what they require. So you really need to talk to the landfill directly.
Right, that's true. Yeah, always check with the disposal facility to see if they're accepting that, when they can, if they can, and what requirements may be on that just for that facility itself.
Has the department given consideration to banning the use of biosolids on agricultural land completely?
Has the department
given consideration to banning the use of biosolids on agricultural lands completely?
Yeah, we have considered that. Obviously, that's one of the many options that could happen. We've talked about it. We've looked at it. But we feel that these restrictions that we're proposing now, and not only the analytical standards, but also just the site restrictions, incorporated with what we already have, the buffer zones, the slopes, the incorporation requirements, public contact limitations, no more grazing, no food crops. We feel like all of this put together minimizes the risk, and we decided this is the right approach. But yeah, we had considered that. We had considered completely ending Class B land application. We think that this is the right approach to go forward at this point. We're really looking forward to getting more and more data back to see what everything's looking like as we've started peaking so far. Most of the samples that have come in have been under the MM7 limits, so we're optimistic that, we're in a good place here. But yeah, it was considered.
Okay, we have a few more questions I've kind of bunched together about sampling. Some of this stuff we may have already touched on a little bit, but it's hard to keep track of when the questions are coming in, so maybe this person asked before we answered it and I just didn't realize.
All good.
So will sampling and analysis be just for PFOA and PFOS or the larger class of PFAS chemicals? And then related to that, someone else asked if there are plans to test or include standards for PFAS chemicals other than PFOA and PFOS, especially since those two chemicals are being used less by industry now.
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a good question. So right now, the prevalent testing method that's approved to be used, EPA method 1633 or 1633A, right now that looks at about 40 different PFAS compounds. We're requiring that the whole suite of PFAS compounds be sampled for. Not only just for more information, but yeah, as we progress down the line, more information comes up that, we determine that one of the other PFAS compounds needs attention or we need to look at it, we'll be able to have a good idea of what we're seeing there. But yeah, any sampling that's required under this and both policies have us doing the whole 1633 suite of 40 compounds. So yes, they will need to do all those. No, there are not currently any limits or standards associated with PFAS other than PFOA and PFAS.
And then on that topic, someone asked, why shouldn't we additionally test for total organic fluorine and have regulations around this? That seems like it would be the most conservative.
Yep, and that's a bigger question.
Yeah, we are aware, and part of our research that you're funding at UAlbany is looking at top assay or the oxidizable parameters and also organic fluorine. There's a couple issues with putting it in a regulation right now at this point. In our opinion, one is their test methods have not been certified in this matrix, so getting consistent results for top or organic fluorine across laboratories is an issue. When it comes to organic fluorine, we also have to look at, that gives you an idea. It's a good kind of base of whether there's any obviously fluorinated compounds in there, but it doesn't give you an idea of the breakdown. And remembering that not all these compounds have the same toxicity. So just a total number is a good screening tool. It's certainly good in when you're looking at consumer products, things like that. But when you're looking at environmental risk assessments and that you need a more finite breakdown of the individual compounds, and again, you need a test method that we can use again and again and again with assurance. So that's why we're doing it we're funding it on the research level at this point, but we don't feel comfortable putting it in a regulatory context.
Great, thank you. And just to kind of answer a question I was seeing in the chat about who we have here in the room, I know the way we're coming through on the phone, we're all under Molly's name, but our main presenter here is Molly Tremley. I'm Jesselyn Clays. The person who just answered the last question is Sally Rowland. We all work for the DEC.
Yeah, we all work on biosolids here, so when you see my mouth not moving, I'm not a ventriloquist. There's other people in the room assisting with answering questions.
I've grouped together a couple more kind of agricultural questions for us to talk through. Someone asked if we could give a rough estimate for a typical application rate per acre. I believe that was referring to Class A biosolids, but I'm not sure. It didn't say in the question. Or sorry, excuse me. I believe that was referring to Class B biosolids, but they didn't say in the question.
Yeah. Well, as part of your permit application, you have to propose what your application rate is going to be on each field. So they're already doing that for the nitrogen needs of the crop generally, or whatever other limit may dictate what they land apply there. What this is adding, what this would be adding, was to look at the site life in terms of PFAS. So now they would look at, there's actually a calculation that would be done between the soil and the applied biosolids themselves to ensure that it doesn't go above those levels that we discussed. So you'd actually do a calculation on the full site life of each field based on your material that you're applying, as well as what may already exist in the soil, and both of those need to be analyzed for ahead of time.
Right. Basically, as Molly said, it depends on the crop you're growing. A typical crop in New York State for biosolids ag application is field corn, or which is not obviously for human consumption. For field corn, you're usually, depending on the nutrient content of the biosolids, but it's about 5 to 10 dry tons per acre per year. So you would be driving your application rate based on the nutrient needs of that crop. Then you would look at what is the PFAS in the soil and how many years, that's what we call site life, how many years can I apply on that field before I reach that limit that we put in the regulation. So based on your application rate, you would calculate that I can apply for 10 years or 20 years or whatever it is, obviously depending on the soil level when you start, how much is in your biosolids and how much you're applying. But the application rate itself is dictated by the nutrient needs of that crop.
Great, thank you. The next question, kind of related to this, is someone asked if we could clarify the process of fields being, quote, pre-approved by the DEC before spreading, which DEC regulator will grant approval, and what is the timeline for that? It may make more sense to just have a set limit that soil samples must meet before spreading.
Yep, we hear you there. So it would be part of your permit application process. And then as you progress and you look at your annual reporting, you would need to calculate that future year there. Again, we'll go through, we'll note your comment also and look at what we have now. But historically, we've looked at that in your annual reporting process of what you'll be applying for the following year. But we'll develop a lot of different guidance and kind of help everybody along in the first years of this. I know it's going to be, it's a big change. So we'll do a lot on our part initially to get everyone educated and make sure that each field gets correct approvals and we're dealing with that appropriately.
Yes, it is a little different than typically what we do is we require those soil analyses to come in with a permit application. But we are making an extra step here, as Molly mentioned, to say we want to see your sampling plan before you do it. And the reason there is we don't want you to waste the time and the money if you're not doing it appropriately, because there's a lot of data coming out from different research studies showing how the levels vary by the depth in the soil and how the sampling techniques have to be appropriate. So we want to take that extra step to, one, make sure the data is applicable and it's representative of the site, so that the data submitted to us can appropriately be reviewed. We don't want you to take the samples and then have us make you take them again. As time goes by, of course, and people are more comfortable and we have better guides out there on how sampling should be done, my guess is that will become a much more routine process. All our regional approvals all our permit approvals come out of our regions. That was part of the question of who DEC approves that. Our regional staff review these things, certainly the central office where we work, assist them, but it would be part of your normal process of going through permitting with your regional, DEC regional staff.
Great. We have a couple questions about ways this kind of overlaps with things DER, Division of Environmental Remediation, has been doing. They asked if we can clarify how DER's unrestricted use numbers would apply to a field in comparison to the higher maximum soil concentrations of 1.5 and 3.0 parts per billion.
One more
you want
time,
me to repeat
sorry.
that?
Yeah, repeat that one more time.
They asked, can we clarify how the DER unrestricted use numbers would apply to a field in comparison to the higher maximum soil concentrations of 1.5 and 3.0 parts per billion?
Basically, they're the same philosophy. The DER has not formally proposed those numbers. We want to make that abundantly clear, but they're based on their soil study, and we believe their intent is to go forward with the rulemaking. So we're basically using the same philosophy. DER is saying through their program that using the background soil study to say this is what is found, and these unimpacted, not saying, obviously PFAS comes from air deposition. That's where that's in these background studies, but they're not a specific industrial source or majorly impacted. So, and based on their data that they don't see groundwater impacts at these types of sites, it is likely they're going to go forward with these numbers, the ones we're using too, to say this would be an unrestricted number, unrestricted soil use number. So
well,
the two programs are trying to line up, in essence, with philosophy of how we're treating the soils and the quality of, you know, the materials that are being used for soil.
Related to that, someone asked what studies have been done to show that the background soil levels found by DER in rural areas have not created groundwater issues, and they mentioned the description of New York standards compared to Maine standards. So we have these background soil levels. How do we know that those levels aren't creating groundwater issues?
DER has done a lot of work already looking at other sites, and it's their opinion that their sampling to date has not shown that these background soil conditions create groundwater contamination. Again, as you can imagine, as a remediation program, they do a lot of sampling, get a lot of groundwater data, and that's their opinion that, again, if you look at their background soil study, they also have a very useful question and answer document that goes with that to help answer some of these types of questions too.
Someone asked why PFOA and or PFOS 20 parts per billion is 20 parts per billion for biosolids, but 1.5 parts per billion for PFOA and 3.0 parts per billion for PFOS for soil. Do biosolids not leach as much?
That's a good question. So I'll start off. So the one is criteria for the source material, right? So that's the material coming directly from the plant. That's the treatment plant, biosolids coming in either to a Class A facility or direct to land application. That's the material that's being applied itself. That 1.5 and 3, those are actually referring to what needs the maximum that it can hit in the soil after biosolids are applied. So when you're applying biosolids to a site, right, your site has a certain concentration, your biosolids have a certain concentration, and we're going to make sure that we calculate that after application, that soil will be left with those numbers, 1, 5, and 3, that they'll be left in the soil at those numbers or lower. So that's the idea that we're trying to get at. So that's why there's two different numbers. One is looking at the source material or itself, and another is looking at what the soil is going to look like after it's applied.
Exactly. And remembering that, as we mentioned, biosolids are applied at 5-10 dry tons per acre. The soil layer, just 6 inches of soil, has 2,000 tons of soil. So you're adding a very small amount to meet the nutrient needs of that crop. Mm-hmm. So you're not going to be resulting in a soil concentration at a 20 from adding the biosolid itself. And that's what this is recognizing. Again, this has been done for many, actually decades, in looking at metal additions and things like that. This is not a new concept when it comes to soil additions, but it's something that we're applying here to PFAS.
Great, thank you. We're gonna ask some questions about works now. For the thresholds, both biosolids and soils, this is not strictly works, but we'll get there. For the thresholds, both biosolids and soils, are we looking at median over a specific time period, such as annual? And how many sampling events will be held per that time period? And then I think this is more for the biosolids side. Is that number of events per time period going to be based on work size, or will the samples be scheduled, like so many per quarter?
Yeah, a little of both, kind of. When similar to how our regs are set up already, we'll be looking to propose in the regulations, the revisions, to do something similar. So frequency of sampling will be based on the quantity that's generated. So similar to the way we do it now, it would apply in the same manner. So we'll, currently in our regs, there's a frequency table with how many times they need to go out and do those sampling. We'll do something very similar to that for PFAS as well.
And it is the mean for biosolids, annual mean. So it's the average over the year. For soil, it looks like we're going to be proposing, kind of wait and see, but right now it looks like it will be the median over the year, or over the number of samples in that given field.
Great, thank you. Can you elaborate on the upstream reduction from industrial waste streams? What kinds of recommendations are there for municipalities managing these?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that goes even beyond our program as well. So we've been really fortunate to work with our Division of Water very closely, who, if you're familiar with this already, you're probably also familiar with the TOGS, the Technical Guidance Series, and the work that Division of Water is doing. So one, we have a lot of great upstream programs, a lot of good legislation that's gone through about homeowner things and stuff like that. But when we get into industry, we have to look at the actual types of industries that could be discharging to these municipal wastewater treatment plants, right, to these works. So, when a PFAS sample, for example, comes in at a certain level, there will be criteria for them to then look upstream. And while we don't dictate that from our program, DEC is working in their technical guidance series to be able to provide information to basically speedies permittees to be able to track down those things and get them under control. It's going to be involved, additional sampling will be involved, et cetera. Again, that's not my specialty program, but definitely is happening, and I would encourage you to reach out. Oh, Sarah, you're on. Would you want to jump in and answer that?
I thought I'd try to help you. Sarah Latessa, I'm in the Division of Water here at DEC in Central Office, and I've been primarily responsible for drafting our wastewater permitting program strategy. So I work very closely with Molly. As our TOGS, Molly was just alluding to, states, if a facility is triggered under DMM 7, so if they come back with biosolids results that are over 20 ppb, let's say, or something else that's, suspect, let's say higher than background results, we could and intend on sending a joint request for information to ask for influent, effluent, and biosolid data for a year of quarterly sampling. And once that data comes in, we'll analyze it and determine if a modification to their speedies permit and or their land application permit is needed. If so, that modification would require a track down program, and municipalities that have a speedies permit or wastewater discharge permit must maintain a sewer use law per their permit. And so they have that that allows them to require restrictions on users of their system. So anybody that's discharging to their system, they can ask for additional monitoring, they can require pretreatment requirements, anything like that. So that's kind of how the trackdown will work. They'll try to identify the source and then you implement their sewer use law to require pretreatment where needed. And we'll be providing additional guidance as we learn more. That's also, we're also pretty new in this. So we have resources available on our public webpage.
Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you, Sarah. We have another question next about works that if you want to jump in, feel free to. Another question came in that said, what changes does DEC recommend for rural works that have a high, such as greater than 20 levels of PFOA and PFOS, but no industrial waste streams?
It's a good question. Hopefully we don't have many of those. So we don't want to take your light there, Molly. But where that does happen, we're requesting that you document your trackdown efforts, document that you have no controllable sources, and then let us know what the results of that trackdown program are, that, it looks like maybe it's a drinking water source or a remediation problem. And then from there, we can adjust your limits or action levels and go from there. It might require, some kind of variance from our regulations if you don't have a controllable source. But we need kind of the data to support that.
Right. Thanks, Sarah. And then to add to that on the DMM7 mentality, right, and our mentality is that, if you're sampling and whether it's, residential or industrial, if they're coming in over 20, that source may be restricted from recycling, right? So that is the limit that we're proposing in the regs. So if a source is coming in higher than 20, yeah, that's something, talk to us, right? That's something that we're proposing would not be allowed to go towards recycling. So while it may not impact, your species permit or what you're doing there, if you're sending the sludge from to a compost facility or something like that, it may inhibit that end use option for you. Okay. Thanks again, Sarah.
Someone asked if we have an estimate of what percentage of biosolids may be recycled under the new rules.
That's a great question. Yeah. And so part of, and I feel like I keep saying that, so sorry, but these are a lot of good questions. DMM 7 and 7A are hopefully providing us with a lot more data. So as we move forward down the rulemaking process, we'll be able to see a lot more of what plants are currently coming in at and how we think that the proposed numbers will affect those permits. So we don't have a terrific idea right now. I suspect that some plants will go in other directions. It's up to the municipality to see what they would want to do, right, how they're going to manage that end use in the end. But on the way there, I think we'll gather a lot more information that allows us to see what's the realism of the situation, what's being generated now, what can we look to for these municipalities, and how many may be impacted, how many may be choosing different end uses, things like that. So that was a mouthful basically to say that hopefully as we get more data, especially with DMM 7A, we'll be able to see what that impact could actually be based on what we're proposing.
Great. Are existing permits going to be held to the updated regulations?
That's another really good question. I gotta stop saying that. So existing permits, so in every rulemaking, there's something called a transition, right? Transition to the rulemaking. It'll be part of the rulemaking process. It'll be outlined in the rules when you go to look at the draft. And that'll be how facilities will transition into using the new regulations. Your existing facility, you are allowed by right to operate under your permit that you've been issued by the DEC until it ends. There is the potential that the department, we do have an option if we deem it necessary to do what's called a DIM or a department initiated modification. So that's always a possibility, but you have the right to operate under the permit that you have with DEC currently. And so when the information about, oh no, lost the word. As the transition rules come out, and you'll be able to look at those and comment on them, I think that that'll give you a better idea of maybe facility to facility what makes the most sense for you.
Wonderful. And then someone said that they were wondering, for a municipal wastewater treatment plant that only sends its biosolids output to a landfill, such as selling or recycling for fertilizer, does this apply to them?
Short answer is no.
Great. Someone asked if there are any biosolids sampling or testing planned, any PFAS sampling or testing planned for biosolids that are sent out of the state.
That's okay. Yep. Okay. So So the question was, is there sampling planned for biosolids that are sent out of state? So if a Part 361 permitted facility that, let's use an example, if there's a biosolids composter in New York State, and they have a permit to make Class A biosolids compost in New York State, and they just happen to sell all of their end material to another place, another state, that doesn't matter. As long as they are permitted in New York State, they need to meet the requirements under Part 361. Now, obviously, right there, we just discussed the transition and that whole process, but regardless, like for a new facility coming in, they would need to meet all of those. It doesn't matter where the end destination of that material is. Now, it's different if a WRF itself, so let's say a wastewater treatment plant or a water resource recovery facility, whatever terminology you use, if the WRF itself sends biosolids out of state to be managed there, that's different. That's not being handled under a biosolids recycling permit within DEC. So no, that work should look at what the states that it's going to require and work with their DEC equivalency to figure out what they need to do. That's their best bet. But if biosolids are coming into a Part 361 facility or biosolids recycling facility in New York State, permitted here, they'll need to follow these rules, regardless of where the end destination of their product is.
Someone said that they are working through a Class A permit process and asked if we could speak to source sludge limits and and if they should expect to keep sampling their source sludge if and when they get approved.
Yeah, so the source sludge coming into your Class A facility, you well know now, because you're in the permitting process, that you have you have analytes to measure ahead of time, and then you will also have things you'll need to measure during operation. So just because you get your permit doesn't mean that you stop measuring the incoming source solids as you're operating. There's criteria for that as well. So you will continue to do so under your permit. What this rule would be adding is PFAS sampling requirements as well. So right now, you would be subject to DMM-7 and the sampling criteria that's in there. And then after the 361-3 regulations are revised, you would then be subject to these pending all transition and things there.
For new Class A municipal biosolids recycling facilities under design, what amount of testing will be required on the biosolids to move forward with approval and construction? Will new Class A biosolids recycling facilities be able to be approved and constructed during the interim DMM-7 limit? Yep.
Yes. Nope. We're not holding up permits because of the rulemaking or DMM-7. They're operating as per usual. So no, there's nothing extra you have to do. Everything's outlined there in either DMM-7 or 361 as it is currently. So that's what you should continue to follow. Looking ahead, just know that when you are doing sampling, it's going to work very similarly to how the regs are set out now. You're going to have to sample based on a frequency outlined by the amount of biosolids that you are processing. So a larger facility will have to do more annual sampling than a smaller facility would. So just keep that in mind. It's going to be similar to the frequencies that you see already in the 361 regs for sampling.
Is DEC collaborating with the Cornell FLX PFAS team?
Yeah, I don't know what the FLX PFAS team is, but I'm going to write that down, and
I have it written down.
Thank you, and check into that. Thanks.
Are there enough certified labs in New York State that test for PFAS to handle this surge in PFAS testing?
Yeah, so initially there was a lot of trouble, and that's again why we actually first jumped on board with doing a state-funded research project for sampling. When we first came out with DMM-7, we heard from a lot of plants they were worried about being able to find labs. And we heard that all over, right? The methods were changing. We went from, I think, was it 537? There was another EPA method, and now we have the more sophisticated 1633A. So as we've progressed, more labs have come online. I myself have gone to several presentations by labs with, you know, their lessons learned in processing solids and water and different media types under this method. So it's definitely growing. It's growing all the time. This is not something that like is ELAP certified, for example, in New York State yet. It's too new. But as long as under our regs, if you're using the approved EPA method, that's what we want to see. But yeah, the amount of labs that can handle it and are handling it is growing every day. We're up to a pretty good point right now where people aren't having the same trouble they had back in 2021 when we were first starting to look at sampling at this scale. So as it scales up, labs are also scaling up at a good rate.
We have a clarification question. They're saying permits will be required for both Class A and B biosolid recyclers. Will a farm then that applied these materials need to have a permit, or will it just be the broker of the biosolids? And they also ask if the testing data will be public. Yeah,
I think there's a lot going on in that question, so I'll kind of pick apart little pieces. So even prior to these regulations, biosolids land application facilities have needed to be permitted. So farms that are taking biosolids materials and Class B land applying it on their farms, they need to already have a permit with DEC. So that's far before this rulemaking is going into place. They should already be permitted for those fields. If we're talking about Class A materials like compost, finished compost, those are not currently tracked the same way that Class B is. So from a few slides ago, I'll try to explain the only time we would look at Class A is if it has repeated use on ag. So let's say there's one field, people are using repeated use of the same compost material or biosolids materials repetitively, like an ag application in that case. We would then look at that as a department. It's currently written into what we're trying to propose. And so we would look at that similar to how we would look at a Class B site. So Class B, direct land application, those should already be permitted, regardless of these regs. But when the revision goes in, we'll also be looking at Class A that's repetitively applied at the same site to ensure that site life isn't going to be a problem for those as well.
And just to clarify, for both currently and under these proposals, for Class B sites, it doesn't mean the farmer has to hold the permit. The permit itself can be held by the wastewater treatment plant. It can be held, mentioned a broker, it could be a broker. What we typically see is, yes, either the wastewater treatment plant actually holds the permit or a broker does. And there's an agreement with the farmer on what fields are used and things like that. So this does not obligate the farmer to hold the permit.
Right, yeah, good point.
And the data will be available. I think that was part of the question too.
Yep.
You know, all data we have, we're continually trying to improve how we present and able to share data, and that this is certainly part of that as well.
Right. We do have, I think I mentioned earlier, Division of Water. You can look on our website as it's called the PFAS and 1,4-dioxane information portal. You can go on there and see that's specific to Speedy's permits, but that also includes municipal wastewater treatment plants, where we'll be posting a lot of data from that second sampling study. So that'll all be public. And then every research program, right, every research project that is done through DEC, contracted with DEC, also all public. So yeah, we'll make sure that the data is available.
Great. Sorry, I'm trying to keep track of my questions document here.
A lot of questions.
Everyone's been asking some really good questions. I'm trying to keep track of which ones I've already asked so that we don't have repeats. Our next question, during the past seasonal cycle, has anyone investigated PFAS in algal blooms, harmful or otherwise?
Not that I'm aware of. You might want to reach out to like our marine resources or fish and wildlife programs on that, but not that I'm familiar with, sorry.
This question, I think they probably asked it while we were talking about something. I don't know it doesn't have all of the context, so maybe you could just touch on some of these topics and just give a little bit of background info, and maybe that'll help get the question asker the information they're looking for. They were asking about digestate from farm-based digesters. I'm guessing they may be wondering if that is going to count as like a biosolid, or digestate from merchant digesters only accepting food waste.
Yeah, no, so this will not cover anything outside of the scope of biosolids. So if it's a permitted biosolids facility, it's covered under here. Food waste digesters, things like that, no, that's not applicable here as we move forward. And there might have also been, I'm trying to think of all the pieces of the puzzle.
I know, I think it made more sense if I had seen it right away, but we have so many questions, we can't get to them right.
Another thing to clarify, I think, is, if people have a lagoon or a digester just for manure, that also does not apply. This is, human sanitary waste, right? Biosolids from a municipal plant, not, cow manure or anything stored on a farm.
Another person asked, what impact does DEC project regarding beneficial use and or diversion to landfills?
Well, we're around 15% diversion now. I don't have a great projection from you in relation to this. We have covered that in the past in the state solid waste management plan, sort of like statewide goals for biosolids diversion. Obviously, PFAS and impending rulemakings change how things are managed and how municipalities may choose to proceed. So I don't have a great idea of that. And again, I'm really hopeful that when we see a lot of the data from DMM7A, we'll have a better idea of the impact that this could have and the quantities that we may see going in different directions.
This next one looks like it's in regards to that DER background soil study. They asked if DEC tested any agricultural field soils that never received biosolids, and what if soils that have never received biosolids are above the proposed levels.
Yeah, I don't think any of the sites that they looked at had biosolids on them at all. They just took, I think it was 500. I'm so sorry. You're going to have to quote the exact document. It is on DER's website. You can just look up New York Rural Background Soil Study and find it. We'll say exactly what it is. But they did hundreds of sites across New York State. They were uncontaminated, non-industrial impacted sites, but none of them had biosolids on them. So those were strictly rural background soil studies, not impacted by existing land application.
Another person asked, given the MCLs of PFOA and PFOS were set to 4 parts per trillion by the EPA, isn't it prudent to have at least the same standards for newer, less treated PFAS until the toxicity of these newer PFAS are better known?
Yeah, so that's a drinking water standard, so it doesn't quite apply here to biosolids recycling, but I would check in with perhaps our Division of Water or look into how the drinking water standards are being managed on that side, but those aren't really as applicable here in this rulemaking.
Another person asked if we are concerned with buildup of PFAS in the meat or milk that comes from animals that feed on field crops. I think we had something similar, but it was another question. So.
Yeah, we've discussed livestock. So we would restrict livestock grading. We feel that that is what needs to happen in order to be significantly conservative and not worry for Class B land application facilities. We think that the appropriate risk minimization would be to restrict livestock grazing on those sites altogether.
What about Class A biosolids which don't need a land application permit?
Yep, Class A biosolids that do not need a land application permit. Actually, maybe I can pop back in my slides here. So this top section with the sources, that would also apply to finished Class A biosolids products. So that 20 ppb is what we would look at for finished Class A products.
Great. And then we're kind of going to switch gears a little bit back to land spreading. Someone asked if there are spot checks of fields being spread, and if so, at what rate?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So all of our land application sites are permitted and inspected by DEC regional staff annually. So in that way, I believe, yes. I think, I'm not sure exactly what the question's getting at. If the question's asking for Class A applications, no, there's no tracking and spreading of those. But I mean, when a Class B direct land application permit is held with DEC, I mean, down to the application rate per field, it is tracked very closely. So they actually go through all the analytes, looking at nutrients, metals, and this will propose also the suite of PFAS and actually calculating what goes onto the land from that. And then that dictates what their application rate will be. So every field is handled individually for that, and that's also reported annually in their annual report that gets reviewed by us and regional staff across DEC.
And if the question is really getting at an enforcement issue, DEC does have the ability to do sampling as well. As Molly mentioned, where regional staff do site inspections, we have the ability to go out and spot check, if you will, or do soil sampling ourselves, biosolids sampling. As I mentioned, we're doing that right now with biosolids. We certainly have the ability to do that at land application sites as well.
Yep.
This next question, it looks like this person came on a little bit late, so we talked about some of this, but maybe you could go back in the slides so that they could see it. They asked what restrictions are proposed for fields that are for livestock forage, but not livestock grazing.
Oh, so
they're saying livestock forage such as hay, green top, but not livestock grazing during grazing season.
Yeah, so we wouldn't have any restrictions on like feed crops like that on properties. It would be direct livestock grazing on fields, as well as any food for human consumption crops.
Okay. This one came in a little bit ago when we were talking about MCL levels. They asked for some clarification about why drinking water MCL levels aren't applicable here. They said there are concerns regarding the spreading of biosolids and PFAS chemicals finding their way into our drinking water.
Yep, no, that's a really good question. So the reason that drinking water MCLs aren't applicable in these regs is because drinking water MCLs would actually look at analyzing the drinking water itself. So I'm sure we've all seen that map, right, that everyone has produced a different version of that has, you know, the farm field and the industry and the kind of the flow chart of how PFAS could move, right? Our homeowners, it's coming from all over the place, right? We've all sort of seen that map that outlines how PFAS can get into certain environmental media, et cetera. And everything has a different level based on the pathways that it could reach people. So the reason that the drinking water MCL isn't relevant here is because that is actually applying to water that is directly consumed or, you know, using your home, showering, whatever, for that case. This is specifically referring to biosolids that are land applied on a farm field, obviously, and then the pathway would be, you know, between the soil and the groundwater and that stuff. That's going to be a different number than you're going to see in actual direct consumption drinking water. So those standards are different because of the pathway it takes to be able to reach people, the environment, et cetera.
Yeah, and we understand and appreciate that they are all related. That if you have changing groundwater or drinking water standards from a risk assessment perspective, if you're looking to protect groundwater, that's going to affect your risk assessment and how you derive a soil number or a biosolids number. But what we're saying here is we're using background soil numbers. The expectation is even if the MCL changes, that we wouldn't see impacts to groundwater because of the low numbers we're already using. But we aren't saying that, yes, obviously, if you have changing or lowering groundwater standards in a risk assessment, they do play a role. We understand that.
Absolutely. So at this point, I think we've kind of gone through the questions. There were some, you know, repeats, but I think we've answered the questions here. With the one exception of some background questions that I thought we could kind of answer here at the end. So someone asked if they can access this proposed regulation document yet.
Nope, not quite. So the point of this meeting was really to bring everybody in early so that they could see what we're thinking about doing, provide initial feedback, get an idea of what we're thinking of proposing, and, you know, just get an early jump on this, right? So we have not proposed draft regulations yet. So after this meeting, we'll take people's feedback. We're gonna, you know, discuss with our sister agencies and with our other divisions and work to provide a draft regulation to you. And we hope to have that out for public comment this spring. So we'll be able to, you'll be able to see the nitty gritty of that right now, these slides, right, that you have access to. That's all looking at things that we're considering proposing, which is why we wanted to present those to you today. But yeah, there's nothing available right now, but soon there will be a full rulemaking process where you can have we'll do a formal public comment period, so you won't miss out on that. And if you registered for this and didn't check that you wanted to opt out, I'll be able to update you as we move forward, so you'll have all the upcoming dates and stuff like that associated with the rulemaking.
We had another question about the background soil levels that we were talking about from DER. I just posted the link to that in the chat.
Thanks.
So you all can find it there. Additionally, if you go on the DEC website and Google background PFAS study on the DEC website, it will pop up, but the link's in the chat as well.
We do have a DEC PFAS webpage that was developed that sort of houses what the department's working on, and you can kind of get to everything from one place. So if you want to pop over to the DEC PFAS website, you can get links to the background soil study, the TOG, the guidance values that Sarah was talking about in water, and lots of other things there for you to explore.
I will link that in the chat as well for easy access for everyone. Related, someone asked about sharing the slides. We didn't get this question, but I know we'll also have a recording from this presentation.
Yep.
That will all be shared with the folks who signed up.
Yep, we can share the recording and the slides, and we have all of your contact information. We can keep you in the loop as the rulemaking progresses. So to be respectful of everyone's time, and we're coming up at the end, if anything comes to mind later, you have questions, you have follow-up feedback, you want to connect on something, whatever the case is, please reach out to the email address on here, biosolids@dec.ny.gov. There's there's a group of us here that all can see that, and someone will get back to you, and we'll be able to use any feedback or questions you provide in order to help us tweak our proposed regulations and get those out to you so that we can begin the rulemaking process.
Yeah. And related to that, we did have some chats that were statements, not questions, that we didn't talk about here today just because we wanted to try to get through all of the questions we got, but we absolutely have all of the chats, so anyone that shared like a statement or a thought that they had, that is, that's on our notes document, and we have all of that.
Yeah, and thank you everyone for being a part of this. We had a ton of people register. It was really great to see all the interest around this. We know this is important. It's why we're moving forward. So stay tuned. Look for DMM 7A over the next month to come out, and then for these proposed draft revisions in the spring. Again, really appreciate everybody. Have a great day, and reach out with any questions. Thanks again to everybody in the room too for helping me out.